Well, thank you for being here with us. So once again, I'm speaking with Marina Warner, cultural critic and well-known author, whose book that will be, in a sense, drawing on Stranger Magic, treats some of the themes that come up in this film. There's a whole discussion of Rhino Ger and her history and the development of this film, but also because the film is about or relies on stories from the Arabian Nights, we see that there are all of these embedded tales that are connected to it. So thanks again, Marina, for being with us.
No, it's a pleasure to be here.
So I think one of the ways to start thinking about this is to see how the film was connected to the book and some of the other issues that you started to become interested in looking at the film.
Well, I was mostly interested in the afterlife of the Arabian Nights, the way that the themes had percolated and suffused so many different media, and particularly cinema. There's a huge filmography. And it begins quite early. I mean, this is not even the first, as it were, interpretation of the Arabian Nights, but it's certainly the most magnificent, probably, I mean, across the board, actually. It's an extraordinary achievement. And it has all the problems as well as all the charm. As I'm sure you all noticed, that in terms of Orientalism, the way the Orient is used to depict themes of sexuality and pleasure and decadence and power and the people as playthings, hierarchies, all these things come through very strongly. And she herself was not identified particularly with that. I mean, we can go into her life later, but there's also this extremely attractive aspect, which is so consummate in the artistry. And I, as a feminist, also very pleased that the first full-length animated feature should be by a woman and be such an amazing piece of work. It's also a terrific collaboration. I mean, the music comes through. I've never heard it in a cinema before, on such a big screen with such good sound. I've only heard it on playing a DVD on my television. And this is astonishing. It's such a good score.
Yeah, no, it's really remarkable seeing it here in the theater, and also the reaction of the audience in seeing it and the way in which we identify with these different segments. And that's another really interesting aspect of it in terms of the stories that it draws on. There are a few different stories that it draws on from the Arabian Nights.
Yes, in fact, I noticed some connections that are not apparent. Obviously, she's chosen the ebony horse or the magic horse as the framed tale. She's set Scheherazade aside, so we don't have the actual enclosing story of how Scheherazade saves her life by telling stories, and that she's saving her life because the Sultan has decided to kill all women. But you do see underlying the plot how helpless the women are portrayed as playthings and objects of exchange. So in a sense, she, Lotte Rhino Ger, is embodying the Scheherazade role, telling stories about the plights of women, and then, as it were, inviting our sympathy and redress. We see it with slightly different eyes now, because coming after movements to empower women, we don't appreciate Peri Banu's passivity but if you think about it politically, she's asking us to see the plight of women in that respect, and Dinazad too. Dinazad is actually the name of Scheherazade's sister in the framed tale of the Arabian Nights. So she has kept that idea within it, that Dinazad is as threatened as Scheherazade in the original book.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Lotte Rhino Ger as a figure, and also in terms of her location and the telling of the story, I think you've commented on how we can see a point of view that develops in the story, that Rhino Ger could be understood as a narrator in relationship to the action and the way the story is being told.
Well, she certainly shaped the stories. I mean, the one that isn't named but is quite apparent is the tale of the second dervish, one of the great stories in the Arabian Nights. And that contains the duel between the genies, in which they end up blasting each other by fire. But she's changed it, she's used it to make this marvelous witches' duel, as it's called in folklore, between the two, so that you see those metamorphoses of the animals. That comes straight out of the book. But she's changed the book because it's not a kind of ugly witch. And we can talk about that sort of racial caricature in a moment. But so it's not an ugly witch, it's a beautiful daughter of a king who is the good figure. So it's very interesting that she's made the good figure look actually so, as it were, bestial. And with unfortunate racial overtones, and but that's an interesting choice because she's actually the figure of good magic. So she's done something very different from the book.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting theme. The issue of how good and evil are counterposed in the telling of the story, but also it leads me to think about the scissor work and the idea of what it is that we're watching, which is a form of silhouette animation, which relies on this technique of really cutting paper.
I mean, there are two really fascinating aspects of this filigree work. She used a very, very small pair of straight-bladed nail scissors, and it's pretty much all her own work, not the backdrops which are different in style. But one thing is that this is basically women's work. This kind of filigree cutting is paper frills for cutlets and paper frills for cakes and birthday cards and cutouts that you put against the window to decorate a house. It's a domestic skill, and it was absolutely widespread through Eastern Europe. Coming from the East, I mean, it's also Japanese, Chinese, and so forth. It's quite widespread in the world, but tends to be identified with skills like embroidery, often female coded. But the other aspect of it is very interesting in terms of cognitive studies, which is, I know, something some of you have been studying. And that is that you will have noticed how deeply you see what's happening, in spite of the fact that these are two-dimensional black cutouts. The brain likes to supplement what it's seeing. The gestures are very eloquent. We feel we're seeing something acted. And the cognitive people, Terence Cave had a seminar on this, and on the actual theory of underspecification. The brain likes to engage with underspecified scenes because it likes to supplement. And silhouettes work unbelievably well with I found it quite exciting, even though I've seen it before. I mean, it really involved me. And it isn't just an effect of the music, it's an effect that we have to work to see what's happening because it's actually not being given to us in full. And I think one of the great problems with contemporary realism is that it thinks that if they specify more and more, I mean, the brilliant film Shape of Water, the monster is too specified. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a wonderful film, and I really liked, but I thought that one thing that was wrong was that there's much too much detail in the monster. We need to see him according to how we desire, rather than have him so obviously given to us in every gill and scale and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, this theme of absence that we fill with our imagination in terms of what we see also points to the issue of ornamentation,
yes.
Which is an interesting kind of question because in terms of the characters themselves, it's the ornamentation of the scissor work that allows us to identify them within a story, one of the stories, and yet at the same time, there's absence that goes along with this quality of ornamentation that, in a sense, leads us to identify characters and themes.
Well, the ornamentation is part of the love at the time of the discovery of the East. The countries and cultures are very mixed up. You saw that. I mean, there's a lot of chinoiserie, and there's a lot of. I mean, it's not at all consistent. But it was the time when people were very much beginning to. Well, they'd already started a long time before, but in fact there was a very famous Oriental exhibition in Berlin during that period, the Weimar Period, and it was part of in an attempt to discover, I mean, the intention was good. It wished to know the world, and it unequivocally admired what it found. So it's the beginning of this sort of cult of Persian carpets and these kinds of things. And then the other, sorry, now I've lost my train of thought. I was going to say, so you asked about people and ornamentation. Yeah, sorry.
Well, one dimension of ornamentation also related to this theme of Orientalism has to do with to whom does the story belong? To whom does the Arabian Nights belong? And also, in the way Rhino Ger is working with this, how can we understand this relationship to this thematic of Orientalism, given that Antoine Galland, who was the first French translator of the story, in a sense adapted it, took liberties with it, and this long tale of the Arabian Nights lends itself to this questioning of its status as an Orientalist tale or Oriental tales.
People certainly felt that the book was available to them and they could roam in it freely. Because it didn't have a specific author, it doesn't have a settled edition, though scholars argue about that. I mean, many people think that the first 13 and a half stories, which is the original, the earliest manuscript we have, 15th century probably, they don't even know the date of the manuscript. So it's only got the first 13 and a half stories. So that, some scholars insist, is the Arabian Nights. But the capacious volumes of the other stories, not 13 and a half, but more like, over the 1001 Nights, more like 265 in total. Difficult to count because there are many interpolated within them. That is also an extremely fluid set of stories, and you mentioned the orphan tales. The orphan tales are so called because they don't have original authors in Arabic. They only are known in the French version that Galland wrote. There's no prior source, apparently, in Arabic so far. And that, has meant that they've been deleted from some editions that you might come across. The last scholarly English translation left out Aladdin, because Aladdin is one of these orphan tales that has no Arabic manuscript before the French one, so before the French published version. So it's considered to be a European bastard, as it were, a European orphan. And but my view is, I think there are sort of two analogies for this kind of material. And this is not the only example. I would say the Norse sagas, the Celtic myths, are similar. And I think there are two analogies. One is botanical, and that is that this is a rose, but it can be a yellow rose or a blue rose. No, well, perhaps it can't be a blue rose. It might be a blue rose. It could be dreamed as a blue rose. And it's a genus, this is the Arabian Nights is a genus, and it has many, many species. And it can be cross-pollinated and grafted and so forth. And so that's one metaphor. But the other metaphor that is probably closer is music, which is that, you can have one piece of music within itself, like the Goldberg variations, in which a tune recurs in many, many multiple forms within one piece of work. But also a tune exists in multiple forms of music. So you can have, a tune on a penny whistle, or you can have the same tune set in a symphony, orchestra, and it can be picked up in different ways. And that, I think, is more closer to the character of a story like Prince Achmed and Fairy Peri Banu. It's a kind of a species or a tune.
Yeah, I mean, another aspect of this is the way in which stories are either merged together or, in a sense, told within each other,
Yes.
within the film. How do you think Rhino Ger is developing this mode of storytelling? Is it more like a form of writing in some ways? Is it a sort of narrative technique that's being adapted as an animated way of presenting a kind of visual spectrum of stories and effects?
Well, it's been very coherently bound together by creating this diptych, so that you have Aladdin story and Prince Achmed story, Dinazad's story, and Peri Banu's story. So that's, it's a very crafted amalgam of those dominant two tales in a way that absolutely doesn't exist in the book. I mean, in the book, the Sultan is not the same Sultan. They're just different stories, completely different. And Peri Banu and Aladdin never meet. So she's created quite a tight architecture. It's actually quite impressive, I think, because it's a very sprawling book. And she's read a lot of this other stories. You can see all sorts of little pieces. There's one thing that I think she's completely introduced, which I hadn't sort of noticed before, from European myths, and that is the magic armor. I don't remember magic, as far as I can remember, I don't remember magic armor in the Arabian Nights. But the witch, if you remember, gives Prince Achmed magic bow and arrow and weapons. And that, I think, is sort of taken from much more King Arthur and Excalibur, or other, the helmet of invisibility from Greek myth.
Yeah, I mean, which points to this whole issue about the status of the Arabian Nights. Is it a European fairy tale, or is it really this archaeology of translation, or are they mutually exclusive?
Well, it's not originally European. I mean, even if Galland wrote Aladdin, which is unlikely, he wrote a version of it down. That there's this storyteller who lived in Paris, who was a Christian Arab from Lebanon, Hana Diab, and he was the informant for several of these so-called orphan tales. So, and actually, Paolo Horta has written a book about this theme, called a very interesting book, a very lively book called Marvelous Thieves. But it's absolutely it's a work of Arabic literature, first and foremost. It's just that it had so much, that it coursed through cultures, particularly Europe, but then further afield, like here. And it's inseparable now from world literature. And world literature is flourishing because we have world media. We have cinema, we have computer digital technologies. And this means that there's a far greater interest in literatures in translation. I mean, because we are living in a fluid, translatable world, in spite of barriers constantly being invoked and threatened. On the whole, where it's, the bloodstream is now, the world circulation is quite vigorous, which is a marvelous thing from the point of view of inspiration. Having said it's an Arabic work of literature, it has all kinds of traces from earlier literature in it. So it's got a lot of Persian. The Persian romances are the sort of structure of the Peri Banu figure. She's a sort of, and Peri is Farsi for fairy. So and Scheherazade is a Persian word. So there's a lot of Persian, but we don't have any kind of Persian manuscript. So it was put together mysteriously, we don't know how or by whom, in Arabic.
Yeah, which points to somehow the contemporary resonance of this film and the way we can see it and how we can understand it as this sort of moment in time in which these stories are blended towards these kinds of effects of the era when it was made in 1926 or from 1923 until 1926 with a group of people. So in addition to Lottie Rhino Ger, her husband, Karl Koch, as well as a number of well-known people like Bertolt Bartosz, Walter Ruttmann, among others, were directly involved with the making of the film. And there's a kind of notion of technique of the era as well as an aesthetics of the era that it points to, of the Weimar period. And it's interesting to think about it from that perspective, because Weimar was also a crossroads of that period.
Yes, and actually you can see, when you see it on this large screen, you can see the way there's a juxtaposition of avant-garde abstraction in those backgrounds, which are probably Bartosz, I think, are they? And so there's colored backgrounds which are utterly, and some of the blobs, I mean, the rather strange genie of the lamp is a figure out of sort of symbolism, symbolist painting, rather than out of Lotte Rhino Ger's domestic filigree, her kind of scissor embroidery. That's a different aesthetic from the aesthetic but it actually melds very well.
Yeah, this whole multi-planar approach to the layers that we see on screen is really interesting, and it also points to the fact that there was some division of labor that was going on in terms of the techniques that they were using. So the animation stand might be a part of that. And
I mean, we have to remember that this is 11 years before Snow White, which was the next major feature film, animated feature film. And that Disney was extremely aware of these people. He invited one or two of them to Hollywood, and they came. Ruttmann came and worked on Fantasia. But Disney was, very alert to these techniques. They're extremely innovatory. Although we should say probably that they're innovatory on the basis of a tradition of family entertainment, to do with peep shows and cutouts and projections and magic lanterns, and so it's a development out of a kind of sometimes public entertainment on a small scale. Seaside piers would have magic lanterns, but the use of the colored backdrops, and of course this magnification of these tiny, they would have been very small. Her table, the trick table that she used to make, which was a bit like a sewing machine because it had a treadle and a wheel, and that table was only about this big. So these figures would have been, you can see you can see her making her figures. She gives a lesson in making them on one of the extras on the DVD.
I mean,
they're all pinned together, and you can see all these wonderful joints in the fingers. The finger would be in 4 different sections, all pinned and moved all the time.
Yeah, I mean, in seeing some of that, there were films that were made of how they were describing the film and how it was made, among the other films that she continued to make afterwards in Britain. But one of the interesting aspects also is about the way the story relies on stereotypes. So in addition to the ornamentation, or as part of the ornamentation, there's the quality of the stereotype related to particular figures, like the African magician, among others. And how have you understood the way it deploys all
of course,
that?
it has this, this prejudiced tone now. The African magician is the name of the character in the story. So, but here it requires a kind of diabolical shadow because of Germany and so forth. But and because he looks very Semitic with the, or he looks, I should say, not necessarily Semitic. He looks like Nazi propaganda against the Jews, and that, of course, is an after effect. It's because what the imagery is drawing on, and very strongly in the Demons of Whack Whack, is Christian imagery of the devil, especially German, actually. I mean, when the African magician turns himself into a sort of baggy monster with sort of goat-like shanks, there's one point where he's got legs like that. That's absolutely classic German representations, medieval representations of Beelzebub. So she's drawing on sort of local representations of evil. which themselves, of course, may be tinged with Christian anti-Semitism. But she became very aware of this after the Nazis. She had to flee the Nazis because they were she and her whole group of friends would, even when they weren't Jewish, not all of them were Jewish, had to flee because they were completely intellectually, as most of Weimar was, out of tune with anything to do with the Nazi trend, what was happening, and it all got much, much worse, of course. But so she left Germany. She closed her studio in 1933, the year the Nazis came to power, and began a wandering life with her husband, and then eventually was allowed into England in 1948, and she died in England in 1981. She was employed by a great figure in English film history, John Grierson at the BBC, to make children's films for British television, and she redrew her characters. So she made a new Aladdin, and she redrew them. So that the magician has a little bobble nose. He looks much more like the fairy godmother in Cinderella, in Disney's Cinderella. And various other redrawings that got rid of the racial overtones, the prejudiced overtones that had now become completely inherent in these stereotypes. But they were, and I think the Christian tradition probably was reprehensible as well. But it gained a kind of whole new impact and horror through the Nazi use of it.
Well, one of the things that struck me seeing it again this time has to do with the use of color.
Yes.
So of the era, tinting and toning was one of the ways in which to code scenes in particular ways. So red or various shades of red might be an erotic scene, or it might be fire.
Yes.
Blue might be night. So there are all these different ways in which the story, there's a kind of prismatic relationship to location and time.
Yes, well, you maybe realize who I was trying to remember, it reminded me of, and that is Schoenberg. The Schoenberg's mood portraits, and some of the artists like Kandinsky were interested in the color palette and how it was related to mood. I mean, you asked who was it aiming at, and that's a mystery because it's not really a children's film. The material is sort of fairy tale, and the psychology is very simple, and it's not a sort of subtle interior examination of character, but it's not quite suitable for children. I mean, it's quite sort of strange for children, I think. And one of the reasons is that there is all this symbolic use of color and mood, and the music is not at all accessible to children, I think. I mean, I don't want to be condescending to children, but it doesn't have that appeal.
I mean, what's ironic is that many of her later films in Britain were geared towards children, but in fact, the earlier work wasn't really oriented in that way.
Well, possibly it hadn't quite started, the idea of children's cinema. I mean, you didn't yet have those kinds of, whereas when she worked in Britain after the war, she was in the children's television slot in the afternoon.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting to consider, of the period when she was working, the history of how she started to do this type of work. So on the one hand, she was a teenager, was interested in acting, found herself with Max Reinhardt, and became connected up with the community, and that it seemed to evolve through these relationships with people that she met of that period.
Yes, I mean, it was when she was just waiting to go into an audition that, was it Paul Wegener or was it Max Reinhardt?
Well, Max Reinhardt was trying out actresses, and I guess she was doing
She was making a cutout. Yeah, she was making some marvelous piece of lace, or some of these extraordinary outlines she does. And he noticed it, and he asked her to do the intertitles, the titles for a film. with her method. And but she's very sort of stylish. If you see a photograph of her, you know, she has bobbed Weimar hair, and and she's no, it was and then they were an amazing group because she did a lot of work for people like Paul Wegener, who did The Student of Prague. And that's interesting that, I mean, both Max Reinhardt was making fairy tale films. I mean, his Midsummer Night's Dream, if you've ever seen it, is just exquisite, and was Angela Carter's favorite film after La Belle et la Bête of Cocteau. So those of you who like Angela Carter, her last novel, Wise Children, is set in the actual making of Max Reinhardt's Midsummer Night's Dream. The scenes take place in that on that set in Salzburg, in the castle in Salzburg. So there was Max Reinhardt on the one hand, an extremely sophisticated impresario, who was interested also in this fairy tale world, and then the Paul Wegener was the person who made the films about losing your shadow to the devil. And those films used film as shadow. So there was a way in which you could show somebody becoming, losing their soul, becoming transparent on film, which you couldn't do very easily in the same way in the theatre.
And this quality of shadow play and working with shadows as part of the spectacle itself, you've written a lot about that in terms of the phantasmagoria, but also this archaeology of techniques that have developed historically.
Yes.
Do you think they're consciously drawing on that, or that she was aware of that in the way she was thinking about this technique that we call it animation, but I wonder, was it really just an adaptation of other kinds of spectacles and effects of the period?
I think it was very, very much in the consciousness, in public consciousness, that film had an uncanny way of representing what had been described in literature for a long time as the condition of the shades in the afterlife. You know, when Odysseus goes down to the underworld and he wants to embrace his mother, his arms go through her. And you can do that in the cinema. So that was a kind of, they were very aware of that. But of course you can't put your arms through the shadows. You see you see these shadows as solid. So, but there's a difference, and the word has not entered vocabulary really, but there's a difference between shadow, which is cast by an object blocking the light. So a solid object blocks the light. And the kind of shadow that film is. Film is shadow play, but it's light going through the object. And a philosopher did develop a word for that, which is a filter. So when you see a stained glass window and the light falls on the ground, which is a shadow of the light, but it's transparent, he said that should be called a filter, not a shadow, to distinguish the two states of light, one blocked and one passing through. And this shadow play cinema uses both. I mean, she called her films shadow films. It uses both. I mean, you're seeing both transparency and blocking the light.
Yeah, I mean, what it often leads me to think about is with media, in terms of how we conceptualize it, we're looking for these different kinds of origins, and we're, in a sense, create these different kinds of archaeologies or histories of the medium. But what I think is interesting about a film like this is that because of the Arabian Nights as a tale of origins that are still to be understood and discovered, it focuses more on narrative and the way in which we form narrative in our minds as we watch or read various kinds of stories. So one of the things that leads me to wonder about is the significance and the specificity of this history in relationship to the stories, that in some ways the stories might have more power in the way they recast our understanding.
In this medium. In this medium. Yes, I mean, I was very struck by this lamp at the end, emitting light in this very, very, powerful way. And, that you can animate that through this medium. And I sort of felt it was almost a kind of a hope and a promise, that this medium, which is able to transmit and spread, could be the lamp. It reminded me of, there used to be, at the beginning of certain studios would have a kind of light turning round or a ray, and it was quite close to that, sort of paramount with the mountain and light coming off the mountain, and other ones, Columbia, the torch. These studios had this idea of illumination, and here we had it as if this might be a kind of instrument that could, this medium could be an analog instrument to the lamp and bring good. I mean, it's a sort of just a hope, but it had this powerful radiance in the end of the film.
Yeah, no, that the scenes that focalize the characters around which they congregate, one of them is the lamp, the others are these fighting sequences, which are interesting because, there are examples where either it's the battle between the African magician and the witch, and they transform into these different figures, which is really interesting to see because we start to see that there are these creatures that are, in a sense, transforming, and then we see the result of that.
Yes, I mean, I said it wasn't a children's film, but I think there's an element of humor in quite a lot of scenes. When the snake, when he manages to throttle the snake and then hurls the tail up to the tree and then climbs up it, this is very amusing. And there were other sort of ingenious touches that are full of humor too. I mean, we've been very serious so far, but it is very entertaining.
It's true. I mean, and also the way it depicts sexuality too, I thought was really interesting.
Well, I squirmed a bit, I must say. It's not quite true to the spirit of the Nights, where there are a lot of strong heroines. I mean, I think here you see how sort of Disney liked this. He liked a passive, sweet heroine. Whereas in the Nights, they're much more like the witch of the Flaming Mountain. They're powerful characters. And in the story that Peri Banu is sort of very close to, a story that I like very much, a very long one, which is in hardly any anthologies, which is the story of Hassan of Basra. She escapes him, so he has to go through many trials to bring her back, and eventually he manages it, but it's much more of a task. She's much more of a character than Peri Banu.
Yeah, I mean, and I wonder, we were talking earlier about whether there's a point of view specific to Rhino Ger in the film. Do you think there's any address to this in terms of how the gendered relationships or the way in which women are depicted or the female characters are depicted that has something to do with a point of view that she's bringing to...
Well, I think that the men are very feminized too. So I think it's not... certainly Aladdin is very... But that was a rather sad decision she made when she recut the figures, because her Aladdin here looks very East African, which fits the geography, actually. She's not very accurate on lots of things, but that fits the geography very well, because the sailing scenes, it's a great maritime culture, East Africa. So he looks very Somali or in his profile to me. But by the time she recut Aladdin for her children's film for the BBC in the 50s, she makes him a little snub-nosed, turned-up nose with a little blonde quiff. So she's totally abandoned the Aladdin from Africa or Ethiopia.
So why don't we open it up to some
yes.
questions or comments that any of you might have.
Hi.
Hello.
Well, it's been very interesting to follow along as you connect all these narrative and stylistic features to these like contextual influences of Rhino Ger's life as she was making the film. And you mentioned that she changed the like wizard's duel so that the like good witch of the mountain killed the evil magician. But what I was wondering is why the hero didn't actually vanquish the antagonist. I thought that was really interesting that there's this like secondary good character that kind of vanquished the evil in the end, and then kind of comes back and is like, oh, like you're, what'd you say?
You're my friend.
yeah, you're my friend. Your foe is dead or something. Like it's been done.
Yes, no, it's a very good point. That. The heroes are not very, I mean, they're not entirely heroic. I mean, another scene that's sort of quite difficult for us is, of course, the scene where he steals her clothes and then pursues her when she's very vulnerable without her. I mean, I think if you do know the book and the stories in the book, you do fill it up a bit more, because her magic cloak is her identity. So she needs that. She needs her magic cloak. She can't. It's not just her clothes. It's her being as a fairy. So he's stripped her of her identity, and made her, grounded her when she's really a fairy and she doesn't want to be in this world. So it's a violence and that. So that they're not very. They're not entirely heroic, which is kind of interesting. But I think when one discusses things like this, it's perhaps a danger to forget how entrancing it is. I mean, it has this sort of endless surprises of ingenuity, and this exuberant decorativeness, extraordinary, the lattices and the lace and the shoes.
Yeah, especially
which have been imitated by Alexander McQueen. I mean, I'm sure he did,
I'm sure, yeah, it's interesting.
How about this? Was she familiar with wayang? Because the profile cutout.
Wayang Kulit, Indonesian shadow.
Oh, yes.
Okay, because that's what it most strongly reminds you of.
Yes. They did know about it, yes. I mean, in fact, it's a tribute, probably. We should have mentioned that. And it's a tribute to that kind of puppetry, the shadow puppetry with the beautiful cut-out holes, yes. Wayang Kulit, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Before, we had both made these PowerPoint presentations with images and slides, and yours had an example of Wayang Kulit shadow play as an inspiration.
But we can't play it here.
And I think it was widely known of the period. So.
Well, it was part of this tremendous desire to discover the world that began. I mean, it was partly to do with imperialism, but not entirely. And perhaps the intellectual and cultural expressions of it, though complicated in their intertwining with the imperial adventure, were also genuinely fueled by curiosity and admiration. It wasn't, just desire to conquer. It was, and I don't know when the first reports on Bali and other places where you get shadow puppetry happened, actually, but by this stage they were known.
I was just stricken by how she showed that Arabs in general are good people and very heroic in the sense that will defend good things versus bad things, contrary to what we see in movies nowadays, where most Arabs are portrayed like terrorists or doing offensive things to other people. And also the way that the prince and his father and sister were dressed remind me very much of the Mughal Empire in India. They were very dressed like in the same style. So
I mean, it's quite detailedly researched. I mean, for example, in the harem scene, where you or in the scene with the girls on Wak Wak, though they are based, as I'm sure you noticed, on Josephine Baker, the dancing. The actual scene, the furnishings are very carefully researched. That swing sofa was something that only existed in the Middle East. In fact, it still doesn't exist here. I mean, to have a swing sofa.
Yeah, but I think the point also about the depiction of, characters or characters from the Middle East and the way in which it enters into this quality of a tale. It's not really coded in the same way that contemporary film is.
No.
So.
I mean, there's a liking for splendor. I mean, there is an association which certainly Edward Said didn't like very much, disapproved of, and which is that there's always luxury and hedonism and pleasure in the sea. So in the caliph's birthday, which is, as you quite rightly say, very Mughal, with elephants and tumblers and jugglers and things. It's all splendor. It's all very kind of envy of Said would have seen this sort of envy of the wealth and the luxury, sensuality of the culture. So he saw that as very stereotyped. It's just a bit more complicated because there is admiration in it too.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I was just curious, as far as I know, after this, she turned to more European fairy tales as material to base subsequent films on. She didn't make another major film with Oriental themes, other than redrawing certain characters. Why do you think that was the case?
She had made some European fairy tales before this, actually.
That's
she
right,
made
yeah.
a Hans Christian Andersen Flying Trunk and one or two others. I suspect that it was the BBC. She made all her other, I think they were mostly... There was one film she made of the Frog Prince in colour, very beautiful, short. She never made another long film. They're all shorts that we have, I don't know.
Yeah, that's all I've seen.
She wanted to make, very interestingly enough, she wanted to make L'Enfant et les Sortilèges, The Child and the Spells. She bought the rights. This is Colette's libretto to an opera by Ravel, which is about a very interesting connection with animation, because what happens is that the little boy is very naughty, and he tears his nursery, he breaks his toys and tears his fairy book, and sets fire to his curtains and strangles his pet squirrel and behaves really badly. And then in the opera, they all come to life again. The page that he's torn in his fairy book, the fairy comes to life out of the book, and they all reproach him for his behavior. And it's got a lot of Chinese music, just like this. Chinese, pretense music with bells and gongs and things, just like this film. And at the end, he says, in fact, the translation was sometimes the magic word, because at the end, he breaks down in tears of repentance at what he's done, and cries out, "Maman," and then everything goes back to normal. So it's a piece much loved by psychiatrists because it's got this idea that if you yield to your love, if you accept your love, you will be healed, and the world will set itself to rights around you. That if you can love in a direct way, you will. So maman is the key word. Well, Colette wrote this marvelous script, marvelous libretto, and Lotte Rhino Ger bought the rights when she was in England, but she never put together enough funds to make it, which is a tragedy. But of course it has this relationship to animation because everything comes to life.
And thank you very much for joining us for the film and the discussion.
Thank you.